We have been a bit formal on the rules for open debate. Those rules are out the window. I would like to see some passionate debate. I want to see people who can handle the truth. And a quick comment here: Yumi in the movies, Galactic Star Cruiser and Galaxy's Edge, both being themed after the new trilogy and not the original trilogy, is all the evidence you need for negligence. Perhaps a comment to keep in mind. It is now open debate on count three and count three and actually any count in the trial. Open debate, which will go for the next 30 to 40 minutes. Anyone who would like to begin?
I actually would like to begin for the defense. I have a question for you. I have 3 strikes, and I believe this is the reason why count 3 100% is proven here. Bob Iger's choice to create an impossible release schedule is the first strike. Every 2 years putting out a Star Wars movie, it just doesn't work. You need 3 years. Strike number 2 is Kathleen Kennedy not hiring a Star Wars expert to help advise and guide her team. And of course, strike 3 was not having a unifying vision that would properly tell the story in a way that respects the first 6 movies that came before it.
I would. Sorry.
No need to apologize, Mr. Willie. Jump right in.
I would argue
all formal decorum. This is open debate.
Okay, I would argue for your counts as such. Number 1, with the release schedule, Marvel was able to release at the time when they bought Lucasfilm 2 movies a year, and were able to make money. So the fact that they did every other year, it was something doable. Number 3, they did have an expert in Star Wars. They had, now love him or hate him, Pablo Hidalgo wrote wrote books on the dictionary of Star Wars, or on the lore of Star Wars. Huh? Pardon?
Yeah, the show Bible, is that what you're talking about?
No. He wrote
Bible?
books. No, he wrote books like of the dictionary of Star Wars, or and I think he wrote another one about the lore of Star Wars. So, in theory, they did have experts of Star Wars.
Well, Kevin Feige was an expert on Marvel, right, and also a fan of the product. So the reason they could get out multiple films in such a quick amount of time was that he was managing it from the front. Hidalgo wasn't an upfront person managing this, wasn't Kathleen Kennedy's right-hand man. There was no person to give guidance to make this thing go quicker. They're also working on a franchise that hasn't been produced in a very long time, that needs extraordinarily amount of time instead of a superhero franchise. So I would just say that not having a second, a person like a Kevin Feige to do that would make it impossible for them to do it every 2 years. J.J. Abrams also did both of the Star Trek movies before handing over the third one. So the fact that he handed over the second one, I think, is an indication that he didn't have enough time to do 2 movies. If he's doing 7, there's not enough time to do 8, because it has to be written, it has to be prepared, and he's still producing 7. So I just think that makes it an impossibility.
And not only that, to my colleague's point, when you're already producing a film before the last one has come out, you have no idea what kind of feedback you're going to get on it. Granted, they got very positive feedback from The Force Awakens. So I don't know if they would have went down the road of allowing Rian Johnson to deviate so much had that been the case. And by the time we get to episode 9, the box office had dwindled so much and so bad that we have not had a movie since then. That was a point that was made just recently in our super chat session here. So yeah, I'm curious as to your guys' response to that, because in comparing it to the Marvel Universe, I don't know if you really want to keep going with that, because what happened to the Marvel Universe after a little while? It crushed under the weight of itself. And here we are now at a point where the Marvel Universe is on the brink of in the same place that Star Wars did it, but in half the time.
Well, I would like to make a meta argument that is not necessarily specific to count 3, but is specific to the whole idea of Star Wars being dead. And one of the things that I hope that people come away from this trial, whether this ends up finding Disney guilty or not, is we need to understand that there is this idea called Star Wars. And that idea called Star Wars is not something that is wholly owned by Disney. Yes, they have the legal right to produce products that have Star Wars stamped on it. Okay. But they don't have the power to tell us what is and isn't Star Wars. That's the fandom. And if we walk away from this trial, any way, shape, or form, feeling that we are beholden to Star Wars, to Disney for anything Star Wars, whether it's another movie, it's another game, it's another book, whatever, then Disney wins, because they are the ones that want us to believe that they control everything Star Wars. And I want everyone to understand that the reason that I'm on the defense is because I'm here to defend the fandom and defend our ability to keep this franchise alive, regardless of what Disney ultimately does. And I want to point to previous franchises that live on despite the fact that their IPs have been in bad places. Star Trek got a movie franchise because of the fandom. Firefly got a movie because of the fandom. Star Wars exists because of the fandom. And as long as we, as the fandom, continue to hold the flame, continue to tell whoever owns the IP, whether it's Disney or somebody else, that we want good Star Wars stories and that we will pay good money for Star Wars stories, then Star Wars lives. And regardless of what Disney does, as long as we do our part in this thing that's known as Star Wars, and part of that is what we're doing here.
Well, I love the defense's positivity and outlook on this. And, that's great. I mean, but at the end of the day, business is business and life and death are what we're arguing here. And you can buy something, you can take it, and it is yours at that point. And Disney had that right to do whatever they wanted with it. And what they did with it is murder it, sadly. And that's the argument we have here. Because if there was a future for the franchise, it was dead with them.
Okay. And art, as I've made the argument before, art is not something that exists in a vacuum. Art exists because it has an audience. And the way that audience interacts with the art is determinative of what happens to that art. Okay?
And I'm not going to argue about art because that's obviously in the eye of the beholder. But I will say that I will give you credit earlier for saying that.
And the beholder is the audience.
Yeah, and I will say this.
Ultimately going to decide whether or not Star Wars dies.
And I totally agree with you, and I'll give you that point. And I will also agree earlier that maybe my car analogy wasn't the greatest, but I think there's a point that needs to be made here with that windshield wiper. What that windshield wiper was an improvement on the vehicle. It wasn't something that took away from it. It wasn't something that destroyed the car. Disney had every opportunity in the world to improve Star Wars, to build upon what was there, regardless of what state it was in at that time. Instead of building upon and nurturing it, it decided to malnourish it, bleed the blood dry, and leave it to die a riddled, dead mess, where today a Star Wars show or movie cannot even muster enough energy to get people excited on Disney Plus. And we are sadly at this point where they're just basically cutting pieces off the corpse and selling it to us.
I would like a court graphic of Tom's last statement there, Mr. Connor's last statement, please. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. There you go.
That's pretty close.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Blackwood.
I'm only seeing that in my nightmares now.
So I also want to make the point that, if in fact we do decide that Disney is indeed guilty of all of these charges, at the end of the day, does that really do anybody any good? the point that we as the fandom have to make to whoever owns the IPs of our beloved franchises is that these franchises exist because we made them exist. We were the ones who spent that money. We're the ones who gave them the money in order to make these things real. And we need to be clear as a fandom to whoever owns these IPs that we demand better. And so again, that's on us. That's not on Disney.
Well, the good news is, Father Tom, I do believe, I love what you're saying because I feel the exact same way about Star Trek. But the reality is that, you know, the fandom does feel the way it does because the fact that they have failed to, you know, they've mishandled the franchise. If they hadn't mishandled the franchise, you wouldn't be having open court critics like we have here. We wouldn't have so much criticism. We would have more people at the box office. We would have more Disney movies. The reality is that we don't have these things because they have failed. And it is important that us as a fandom that we use. And I think you've actually done the best job of helping the prosecution today, sir. I believe you've said that we need to, as a fandom, to speak up and to, you know, be true to what we believe and what we love, and we need to use our dollars and our voices and to show them what we like and what we don't like, and show up to the things that are good and don't show up to the things that aren't. And until Disney can do that, then Disney has failed.
But failure and negligence are two different things.
Well, and I think another thing to your point, sir, if I can add this to the evidence, not to get too formal again, but it was brought up by in the audience that Star Wars used to be the third highest grossing franchise of all times when it comes to these kind of IPs. Now, this recently came out, and it has been bumped down to 4. And this is when they've had more movies and toys than they've ever had in the history of ever. So if there really was a fandom there to support it, they're not there anymore. I don't think. I don't know if you can add that to the screen there, Alan, or not. There you go. As you see here, this is a recent release here from Title Max. And yeah, Star Wars is down there at 4th place. And it went from 3rd to 4th. And that's when it had more things added to the franchise, which should make it go up. And it did not, sadly. To where Winnie the Pooh, which has had very little to nothing come out in the last 10 to 20 years, is still down, still over top of it. That's pretty bad. And Mickey Mouse as well has overtaken it.
Just to be clear, being the 4th top.
Now it's 5th, but
4th, top grossing franchise in the world is dead. Just to be clear.
Unfortunately, I think I know where you're coming from with your argument, but the fact that it was at that place before Star Wars was taken over by Disney, and the fact that it has now been demoted when there's actually more movies, more shows, more merchandise than there ever has been before, I think that's all the proof you need that this franchise is dead. And Star Wars killed it.
And mishandled. And
mishandled. And it was died due to mismanagement and negligence at the same time. You had several parties that went out of their way to do their own thing and were selfish. And you had other parties maybe out of negligence or trying to appease others with no real malice. I will concede that, but that does not change the facts that, as you've pointed out, a franchise with a legacy that goes through generations has basically been killed in less time than it's been around. It's just insane.
Well, there are ups and downs in every IP and every franchise, and there are other franchises that have survived pretty horrible runs. I would give you Godzilla, for example. Godzilla is one of my favorite IPs, and there was a run there where the movies that got produced were really bad, but it's still around today. It's still producing really good movies, really fun movies.
And I would counter with that when we had the 98 Godzilla. What did Toho do? They turned around and counterbalanced it with their own franchise to reinvigorate it again because they saw the damage that was inflicted. Disney didn't do that when they saw the damage that was inflicted, they continued to bludgeon it to death instead of try to revive it.
So this brings up an interesting point, and that is that this is something that comes I bring to this particular court experience from the RPG world, which is a little bit different than the movie world, but nonetheless I think is analogous. One of the games that I play is Dungeons and Dragons, but it's not Dungeons and Dragons, because there's these things in the world called retro clones, which emulate Dungeons and Dragons from 1977, 1981, 1984, etc. And these are made by fans for fans, and they keep the game alive. Okay. And when it comes to things like Star Trek, there are plenty of media out there that have made things that are Star Trek but aren't Star Trek. The Orville and Galaxy Quest are Star Trek shows and movies, but they're not Star Trek. We, as the fandom and as creators and creatives, can do the same thing with Star Wars. There are plenty of things about Star Wars that are universal that we can, show and demonstrate that that's Star Wars, even though legally it's not. And if we can do that and do it in such a way that makes Hollywood say, there's money to be made there, we can change the game. And in fact, that has recently happened in the RPG world, where Wizards of the Coast has been put in a very uncomfortable position because fans, due to what they're doing with that product and making their own stuff and making lots of money with it, have forced Wizards of the Coast to try to change the game. And it's going to be a really interesting ride in the next several years to see what happens. We, as the fandom, need to do the same thing. And that's not due to, and in large part, this kind of falls on us, not Disney, because we need to be better stewards. We need to be more careful with our money, more judicious with our money.
And that's admirable. And if I get a dog that looks just like my old dog, I can love it just as much as my old dog, but it still doesn't make it my old dog. And fans can make new things all day long. That still doesn't make it Star Wars. And I'd love to hear more from Willie or my colleague here on this as well.
I would say is that part of the problem with the case when you're arguing negligence or malfeasance is that you, in order to definitively prove it, you have to have their financials, and unfortunately, we are not privy to those financials of Lucasfilm. So I mean, it's kind of a hard case to make without that. So I mean, we're just kind of fumbling around with mainly emotional arguments.
Well, what we do have proof, though, that they intentionally went against George Lucas's intended vision for the sequel trilogy. We do know that it was their intent to shift it towards a female-oriented saga instead of it being inclusive of everybody, or basically in line with the more classic form of the franchise. And, Kathleen Kennedy herself has said that we're not here to appease to 50-year-old fans. And I think that was the point where they intentionally, what it may be second-degree murder or however you want to put it, it sure ain't homicide, it's murder. They intended to do something here that changed Star Wars as a whole, and it did not work out for them in the end. That does not mean they didn't kill it. That's what happened at the end of the day.
I would argue. Oh,
okay.
Sorry.
I would to speak to the idea that introducing, the idea of the Force is female. I agree, it's a bad idea, but it's also an idea that for many years was making money. Outrage marketing is a thing, and it works. The Colin Kaepernick thing with Nike increased their sales by 31%, and they made $6 billion by creating controversy. So the idea that the Disney is willing to stir controversy as a PR move to try to make money on their new franchise quickly is not negligence. It's a business strategy. One that I disagree with, one that I don't think worked, but it is a business strategy.
Well, if they had at least pulled it off. So I mean, if they wanted the Force to be female, that's fine. But the problem is they turned Rey into a Mary Sue, and you cannot have a character who can come in and just do everything that your legacy characters could do without having any knowledge or study or expertise, and just can magically do these things. And I think anyone would agree that with their head screwed on straight, that's just a stupid thing to do. I mean, we're talking about mishandling the franchise. I mean, for the love of God, anybody who watched that movie the first time through and stopped and looked and went, how the hell did all that happen? I've been watching Star Wars for how many decades? How the hell did that happen? And why isn't there someone there to say, hey guys, why are we doing this? This doesn't make any sense. How does Rey automatically know how to use the Force once she meets Kylo Ren? How does she immediately duplicate all the things that he can do after years of studying and meditating and practicing? I mean, it's just, they mishandled the franchise because they thought that fans would show up no matter what. It's the same problem we have in Hollywood now with most of our IPs. They just believe with a lot of these franchises that people are going to show up anyways. So they're going to continue to slowly push the peg towards a greater audience. The reason why the Force is female is because half of the population is female. And they know that the majority of the excited people about Star Wars are male. And so they already said, hey, we already got those assholes. We already got them. So let's go ahead and just now we're going to go get the ladies. Okay, that's what we're going to do. And that's exactly what they did. And they failed, and it was mishandled because it turned out to be shitty Star Wars.
I just saw in the chat a comment about Finn and how the fans wanted Finn to be the new hero. Another business decision that Disney made, and again, one that at the time was a good one, was that Hollywood was making bank in China. And one of the things that China does not like is, unfortunately, people with darker color skin. And so, as we saw with those posters, Disney made the business decision to de-emphasize Finn. And so, in order to placate to an audience that they thought they were going to make billions of dollars from, they made certain choices. Are those negligent choices or just bad choices? Again, all of this comes down to business. And at the time, Hollywood was courting China. And so there were certain business decisions that needed to be made. Is that neglect? Is that mismanagement? Or is it just bad decisions? And I would argue that it was just bad decisions. And certainly,
But isn't bad decisions mishandling? I mean, basically, doesn't that
you
indicate that it was mishandled?
A bad decision is not necessarily mishandling. Okay. There are plenty of decisions that you can make that are bad that could end up being being good due to the outcome happening regardless. So no, I don't think it's mismanagement. Mismanagement would.
Would you say that they succeeded with the franchise? So if we say, let's say it wasn't mishandled. So let's say it was handled properly. So what are the indicators that would say it was handled properly? It had great box office numbers. The fans are super happy. The story makes sense and everybody had a good time. Is there an argument that that's the case, or would we say that the overwhelming majority of people would say it was mishandled?
Well, I would argue is that look at it from Disney's point of view, is that expanding the fan base from their original target audience of males who are in their 40s or 50s to younger audiences, to female audiences, to China, which is not normally or overseas audiences, I should say, to expand Star Wars. Would that be a good decision or a bad decision? Because what they're doing, while maybe not being necessarily successful, they are trying to bring Star Wars to a more wider audience.
But if it's not Star Wars done properly, then is it Star Wars?
I would argue. Well, I mean, that's part of the gag, is what is Star Wars? Because I'll be honest, even Lucas with the prequels had trouble defining what is Star Wars, because he made the Jedi's just a bunch of people wielding lightsabers, and that's not necessarily what Star Wars is at least from the original trilogy.
Yes.
So
we had Han Solo in the first Star Wars say that being a Jedi was being part of a hokey religion, and where was the religion in the prequels? I didn't see any. So what is Star Wars is a legitimate question, and one of the ways that you have to answer that question has nothing to do with Disney.
Well, George, I think, gets to define it, right,
Father? I don't think they're Star Wars. I mean, I don't think you'd find anybody who would say that the Christmas special should, be Star Wars.
Well, George would like to destroy it as well. What did he say? He'd love to go around if he had the time or the money and destroy every copy of the special.
On the point of negligence and mismanagement, I think I have at least one main exhibit leading into others to add here to this, if you will, Alan. Basically, that is Kathleen Kennedy herself is generally out of the loop, it seems, and she's supposed to be the head of Lucasfilm and the producer of these movies. And there was a time where she didn't even know anything about the whole Carrie Fisher business in episode 9, and Carrie Fisher's brother even had to correct her on it. I mean, so that tells me she's not even paying attention to what she's supposed to be paying attention to. On top of, let's jump ahead to another point where Miss Kennedy wasn't very observant of what was going on. She let an Obi-Wan Kenobi show go to the point where they had to rewrite it because it was too much like a show they already had in Mandalorian. I mean, to me, that is just gross negligence at this point. You have the person who's supposed to be in charge of this thing who can't even keep track of anything and doesn't even know what's going on half the time, it seems like.
Well, I would argue is which unfortunately the article doesn't point out, and unfortunately we may never actually know, is how exactly was the Obi-Wan series like the Mandalorian. And
it says in there that it was like the cub and lone wolf aspect.
Cub and lone wolf aspect, and I mean you look at the Obi-Wan series, and you can kind of, and fans understandably railed against the fact that, like, oh wait, why isn't he watching Luke Skywalker? Which was his whole point of being on Tatooine. So, I mean, they, in kind of excising that part and trying to make that part different from Mandalorian, they ended up making something that the fans hate. I would argue maybe that it depends on what the script says and how the story went out, of how much similar or dissimilar, or maybe, who knows, maybe they should have just ran with it anyway, even if it was similar to Mandalorian aspect anyway. It's kind of hard to say without being either in the room or having the scripts on hand, to be like we got with Duel of the Fates, the episode 9. So I mean, it's part of the problem. I mean, that's also part of the problem with, like, how you said, how you had earlier, the people that Kathleen Kennedy fired. I mean, exactly what were their stories and treatments like? Could it be that the Star Wars we got was the best that they were able to get because the talent pool was maybe not up to snuff?
I can't believe turning Obi-Wan Kenobi into the Reva television show is the best that they can do, and I will venture that there's people sitting here in this audience who could walk into a writer's room and produce better product than came out of that Obi-Wan series. So I don't know if that's a good argument that there's not the talent available. Is there the desire to give the fandom what it is that they want? And have they yet figured out that they don't have an endless supply of money to which pull from? And at some point, there's going to be a reckoning for what they've decided to do.
And Cyber Skull Media for 5, evidence of mismanagement. making a theme park and catering only to the sequels instead of evenly to all three trilogies.
I'd like to make a rebuttal to that, Mr.
Please,
Gore, if that's
please,
all right.
Yes, of course.
So the thing is that you got to understand, when they were developing the park, that was around when The Force Awakens came out, and that made over $2 billion. So the idea of them trying to appeal to new fans or younger fans versus the older, expanding their audience, that makes some business sense.
Then why do the Star Cruiser that you have to shut down a year after its opening?
That would be negligence.
No, I think it would be basically is that you can, as a creator, you can make everything as best as you can, but you still are kind of up to the whims of the audience on whether they accept it or not. And I think it's just the audience just didn't accept it. I think.
Well, yeah, but
they had to know
marketing
that,
and the key to descriptions. The key to marketing and the key to these business decisions is an understanding of the market, of the fans. And when you don't placate to the fans and give them what they want, they will not in turn give you their money. And I think that was the problem with Galaxy's Edge.
Script Doctor says, while I agree that Disney has damaged Star Wars, the charges of murder have yet to be proven. As a pivotal part of a murder charge is intent. Can the prosecution prove Disney wanted this outcome? There will be.
Well, I think I made my point earlier a little bit, at least I tried to anyway, with the whole idea that the fact that they went away from Lucas's original vision, they intended to alienate the older audience by bringing in these new people, because the way Kathleen Kennedy in her old words said it, we don't need 50-year-old fans. And at that point, I think it's a little hard to step away from. There was some intent there to destroy what came before. It's even said in The Last Jedi, kill it if you have to.
GJJ for 5. Why cater to the new young fans when the old fans will be paying for it? It's like
Amen.
The reverse of Social Security.
If I may,
yeah, Mr. Willie, yeah.
That's a traditional That's actually traditional marketing, is to cater to new fans, because to younger people, because they have more disposable income than people who are older. Since people who are older tend to have college debt and mortgages, all that jazz. So that's standard marketing procedure.
The problem is marketing's wrong
always
now.
Broke.
But yeah, and also, all my kids still live at home, and they're in their 20s.
Exactly.
So, I'm still paying for everything.
Yeah.
Daniel for 550 says they had more believable, strong female characters in the EU already. Mara Jade Skywalker, etc. And they simply tossed it all out. Now we'll be moving to final thoughts, final arguments as we wrap things up for today, from the prosecution, from the defense. Your final, just bring it all home, bottom line, your last chance to yell at each other.
I think the defense has done a good job today. And I got to tell you, I think the first thing I said when I was put on the prosecution was, I feel very bad for the defense on this one. So I respect everybody's opinions here today. And I do want to say, though, that I do think that we've proven without a shadow of a doubt that there has been mishandled. I think my esteemed colleague, Mr. Connors, has done a great job today, pointing out multiple things that would indicate that that Disney has mishandled the franchise at the very least. Even if we can't prove murder at this point, we can prove that there has been a mishandling of the franchise.
Gross negligence, yes.
Gross negligence, a desire to abandon legacy fans, and just I would call it an overall lack of awareness of what is right. And maybe a little bit of idiocy as well in decision making. So,
and I think in abandoning the fans, that's no different than, say, if you were to, starve somebody to death. It's still murder at the end of the day. You're starving a franchise of its core nourishment.
Well said.
And you may not necessarily have intended to kill it, but at the end of the day, your gross negligence did kill it. And that would be of Rian Johnson, Disney, Lucasfilm, Kathleen Kennedy, and the rest of the bunch.
Bob Iger. Yep.
Bob Iger.
Going to my point is that George Lucas was the creator of Star Wars, and he was playing it by ear, and he managed to be lucky to make a successful franchise. Disney, having bought Star Wars, was now the de facto creator of Star Wars, for the upcoming for foreseeable future. That's what I was trying to say. So them kind of playing it a little bit by ear and letting the creatives be creatives is a risk, not necessarily to the, for their, how well they succeeded in that risk. That's up for debate. And that's, taste is subjective, but they made a calculated risk, and that's my point. And that's my point.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Charlie Day. I mean, Willie. Someone called you Charlie Day.
Yeah, I know. I'm not. It's not the first time I've heard that.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Not a bad thing.